Hello, this is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast, we'll take into consideration one of those problems that is considered to be philosophical in the broadest sense, but it has much, not only wider, but deeper implications for human life in general, as all philosophical problems. And this will be the problem of one, of what is one. For those unaccustomed to philosophy, this may seem like a strange thing to say, but it is anything but, and we'll try to show why. Now, we'll use the approach that was common in High Middle Ages to this problem. It's very, for its peculiarities and for its rigor and depth. Namely, to say that something is one is usually understood, and common sense somewhat understands this as a problem of quantity or problem of thinking about the world in the mathematical sense. Well, this is not exactly correct. This is not exactly true. To be honest, to say that common sense sees this as category of quantity is a bit of a bit of interpretation on my part already, because when we start talking about categories, we are already on the level of higher intellectual analysis of something. People don't think about categories, although they sometimes use this word not knowing what it means, of course, because this is something that is passed to us through tradition, and it is quite normal not to reflect on tradition initially. This happens only afterwards. Well, the problem of one and the many that sometimes comes with it, which is not necessarily a dialectical pair, that is to say, you can think one without many also. This problem is, or better to say, this phenomena, this object of thought, is something that is in fact transcendental to our experience. For something to be transcendental, we already talked about this term in the original sense of the word, is that it is before any other ontological determination of things, that is before things, and that is at the same time common, that is ever present. This is the reason why it is important, and it manifests itself in many forms. Now, when we say one, we usually, as I said, think of number one. So you have one thing, you have two things, you have three things, four things, and then every multiply complex thing can be reduced to some one thing, for instance. And we can see this readily in natural sciences. That is to say, to be more precise, in a popular understanding of natural sciences as physics, for instance, or astrophysics. Where you have this idea of atom, and you have this cosmological idea of Big Bang. All of them, to a large extent, hypotheses, that is to say, not descriptions of something that is observable. You have this striving to reduce a knowledge to something one, to something original, to a cause, to something underlying, and this something obviously has to be in quantifiable sense one. Well, this is not really the original thinking of one that is present in metaphysics. The original is something different. This is, let us call it inverted mode of thinking one, of thinking unity, of thinking uniqueness, whereas one becomes individual or individuum, whereas unity becomes reduction, that is stripping away of something, and where uniqueness becomes uniformity. Now these are not original determinations of one we can acquire, and we indeed should acquire in thinking. The one, in its original meaning, as was understood in the Middle Ages, of course I am here making broad sweeps, because Middle Ages was a period that was very long, and the way of thinking of medieval theology and philosophy was wide-ranging. It was not something that you could sum up in a word very easily, in one doctrine. But this, in the argument, in the inquiry about transcendentals, one is very important among those transcendentals, and I refer to my earlier podcasts about this, not to go into explaining once more what the transcendentals are, the convertible determinations. One is important, and one has, as all transcendentals, has one very distinct property. That is that it transcends the categories. Now, categories are the simplest things that are said about things. The simplest sentences one can construct, the simplest expressions of things. Things said, as Aristotle would say, in a non-complex way. So, category of quantities, how much, category of qualities, in what mode and how, category of substances, what is, and so on and so forth. The one transcends this as a transcendental, and while transcending this, it also encompasses all modes. So to say that one is a quantity, and as I noticed, there are some people who try to interpret theology as going astray by taking one and simplicity as an object of theology, thereby reducing God to some kind of atom, quantifiable, in fact, implicitly quantifiable magnitude or something. Well, this has very, very little to do with what determinations of one as God have. Because oneness, or one in the original sense, is considered to be convertible as a transcendental with being. Now, what this means? It means something very simple, of course, simple in the true sense of simple, but very easy to miss. Namely, the being is not a category, because categories are something we use in our thinking, for instance, to contract being. And now, just to note this, being is actually contracted by categories, each being, not because we think in categories, but because categories are how things are in this world. So things have to have quantity, not all things, but in this visible world, all things have to have quantity, which stems from their matter, and which can be expansion in space or magnitude, or discrete magnitude of number, of unit, of material unit, of, for instance, series of bodies that are each and every of them is some kind of one, but this is contracted mode of one. This is not the original mode of one. This is not only contracted, but kind of like very low understanding of what it means to be one and what it means to be being, because every category is some kind of being, or that is to say, some kind of determination of being. But being in itself, in its original sense, transcends categories, because every category is a being, and the beingness, which is that which is, or that by all that is and is present in everything that is, transcends categories and is not distinguished by categories in its essence. This is very important. The being is not a genera, so that you can have species of being, which you have this determination that, for instance, that being, man is created in the genera of being, and then man is species of being. No, man is a species of living thing, but both living and the thing are being. So being cuts through all and transcends all and is prior to all. That is to say, it cannot be, by definition, contracted into definition itself. So when I ask you what is being, you cannot answer with a demonstrative logical definition, because definition is termination of the scope of something. The scope of being cannot be determined by human mind. Well, it is convertible with one. And what does it mean? It means that if it is such that transcends all, that is transcendence, this also means that it is one, because if there were two, it is very simple to see, it wouldn't be all-encompassing, it would have to encompass each other or something like that. This is very easy to ascertain. Therefore, the one in original sense is as unquantifiable as being itself. So you don't quantify thoughts, you don't quantify love, you don't quantify what angels do, you don't quantify even what devils do. You quantify material things with accent on matter and not their form. And original one does not do this. Original one, this is not it. The quantifiable one, or oneness, is a modification, one possible way of saying one. But the original way of saying one is saying I am, or it is, or he is, or they are. So this verb is that one. And this is very important. This one is also convertible with truth. As we already spoke about this nice definition of truth is indivisibility of being and what is. This indivisibility speaks one. So being and what is are indivisible. That means being as it is, being eternal being, and God as Father of all is indivisible from each and every being, each and every what is. Now being and thing are not really the same. The thing is something that is defined in a sense that you have abstracted its intelligibility and gave it you are able to give it a form. But being, meaning individual being, what they call in Latin esse, is something that is in act, that is something that has a rather what we would now call dynamic, but is in fact energetic aspect. It is activity, inactivity, or it is in act. And this means this is a distinction that is sometimes very hard to understand why it is so important, but it is because whereas you can give definition of me, for instance, as such and such kind of man, when you take me as I am, you must take me as an act, as a wholeness of my life with all implications, wholeness of my time, for instance. So this is different. The thing would be res, would be something like a petrified being, meaning individual being. These are not the same things. For some, res or the thing is also transcendental, but we'll stick to this original definitions we already worked upon. So being is indivisibility, or truth is indivisibility of being and what is. One is this indivisibility. Now, how can you say that this is quantity? One can argue that this is some kind of taking the mathematical or quantifiable sense of one to connect God and creature, for instance, or to connect the God and everything else. The implication here is that this connection has to be somehow constructed, but this definition or this demonstration, I would rather say, is in the nature of things themselves. When you think on them, you cannot think on them. You can pray, but then you won't be in need of making a strict definition of this relation of truth to being or truth to God, or each and every being to its Father. But this is completely different thing. If you want to have philosophy that is prayer philosophy, you have a wood and iron, as we call it in Croatian. Drveno željezo. It's a completely useless thing. There is a scope why these things are necessary to be put in intellectual terms, because there are no other terms but intellectual terms. And this definition, that is to say, this syntagma of the determination of the convertibility of one and being, is self-evident. In fact, it is self-evident when you think on procession of things from God. Now there are further determinations of this definition of truth. One of them being the truth is adequatio, adequation of intellect to thing. This is this is more special definition, but it can be understood as even sharper definition of truth, because truth is something that should encompass, among other things, and man also, perhaps. And when you do this specification into the encompassing something else, whereby you make definition, that is to say, you more like pinpoint uniqueness or something, you can say that you went further in truth. But you can always go back, because these are convertibles. So the truth is that everything that is indivisible from its origin. When you say that adequatio, that truth is adequation of some intellect with thing, then you can say that this intellect was able to identify with a thing which is made possible by the fact that this thing is indivisible from the being itself. So it is all goes in convertible way. Some things tell us more. For instance, in some of, according to some, this idea of truth, this popular, that is to say, the most famous definition of truth, as adequatio, in fact tells us more, but implicitly you have this simple definition which is rather plain, but this larger truth or larger one or more encompassing being contained. So I remember reading Heidegger, who was very keen to criticize this adequatio idea and to propose, for instance, the idea of aletheia, the unhiddenness of being as a original truth, is I would say obfuscating these ancient and medieval notions, because he was Heidegger himself was very well versed in history of philosophy. I think even mainly this medieval philosophy, he was very well versed in it, and that he simply on purpose plays it out as if he doesn't see that this definition is just a semantic tip of the iceberg, and the rest of the iceberg has been described already in people like Aquinas or Bonaventura or Philip the Chancellor or others. So when you say the truth is undividedness of being and what is, and you say the truth is adequatio of intellect, ray of intellect and things, you don't really say difference. You say one, but in a mode that is specific, that you have to understand, and you have to deal with this and not simply reject one to enforce the other. And this is something that is very symptomatic for modern philosophy, that is always looking in some way to find one instance in philosophy in the West, as it said, where things gone wrong, and then reduces everything to this one. And the funniest thing is, it is not funny, it's in fact ridiculous, in the sense that you laugh with it with a bitterness and anger, rage even, is the idea that you can reduce the source of the problems historically to one event, one era, one thinker, one something, and then you say that it is because that this one era, one thinker, one something did a reduction to the one. That is precisely what you are doing at that moment. Whereas if you were consequent and you knew that reductionism to quantifiable one is a sure way to intellectual hell, to sterility of thought, you would not do that. You would be aware that this is not something you can do, because this approach can put you in position that you can construct pretty elaborate systems, and elaborate systems can be very persuasive because everything in them is meaningful. The trouble is that what you are doing with this is reducing the not only complex but profound history. You are reducing time, the epochs of time, determinants of time, the meaningful wholes of time to one quantifiable unit, be that unit an idea that made everything go wrong, be that unit one man, be that unit one apple. And this is entirely wrong in essential sense, because this is something you cannot do. The people to which some of those, let us call them thinkers for the sake of argument, want to return to are usually some that were before this event. So in Heidegger's sense, it's pre-Socratics, for instance, because he thought that already Plato determined the destiny of the West to end up in posthumanism, let's say. It was called biophysics at his time, which is complete and utter nonsense. But Heidegger devoted his life in demonstrating it and was very convincing. And make no mistake, in making his own errors, he did construct put out some very important philosophical questions that were neglected in his time, because modern philosophy has this strain, which is called English analytical philosophy, that has Austrian origins, that flat out rejects philosophy as such. Heidegger also, for instance, rejected philosophy as philosophy will die out for the sake of something else, but he appreciated its history, whereas these other thinkers don't do that at all. Now this is wrong, and this is what is most troubling for me, is that this is completely modern or postmodern way of looking at things, and then it goes on to pronounce to be some kind of traditionalism, some kinds of return, as if the return is possible, and as if you can leave the origin and return to it, as if your leaving the origin was absolute in a historical sense, and now you have to find your way back to it. This is not true. This flies in the face of what traditionalism, as they call it, a tradition should be, because this is the codification of the eternal truth, and eternal truth is not temporal. So this is very, very important thing, and we have two alternatives. These modern thinkers that dime a dozen do. They say, for instance, well, everything is historicity. There is no eternity. This is for Heidegger, for instance, or they take this eternity as being something unchangeable, and every kind of development or change in some kind of doctrine's form or expression of doctrines is absolute no. This means that they are going awry. These are, in fact, what is very important to note, these are modernity influenced ways of thought, and they very much like the thinkers of this kind of, for instance, theology, like this neo prefix, like neo-patristics, neo-scholastics, neo-this or neo-that, neo-Byzantine, I don't know, neo-medieval, and so on and so forth. When you see this, you can already have a red light on, because this is not proper way, and I don't think it leads nowhere. And once you study, I learned this rather young age at the university, once you start studying the originals, the people, for instance, to which they want to get back, or the people they want to transcend in the past, you very soon understand that they are reading their own mentality into them, and this mentality is modern, even it is, especially when it is expressed as the rebellion against modernity. This is almost a truism to say. So, to get back to the beginning, the one is not quantity in its original sense, and in a sense it is used in metaphysics. There are different ways it was used. You have it in Platonism, Neoplatonism, which is in my opinion the proper form of Platonism, but not Renaissance Neoplatonism. I think Neoplatonism of late antiquity as expressed in Plotinus and Proclus. There are other ways to express one, and none of them, properly speaking, is not quantifying. So I remember listening to one PhD man from America, PhD in theology, when he said, now we'll talk about Platonic one, and so we have to imagine an infinite space, and I stopped listening, because this is a man who has PhD, I think even from Harvard. When you say something like this, I'm perfectly permitted to not consider him anymore, because time is precious. If you know anything about, for instance, Neoplatonic one, of which we were speaking, is that you cannot think in spatial dimensions only as metaphors, but metaphors that are based on a very strict method of demonstrating that they are only metaphors. Plotinus or Proclus, they were very apt in doing this. One is not material. This is very, very important. It is one of the expressions of something that is utterly material. And those expressions have rather different modes and different kinds of thinking. What I was telling you about from this medieval period, this is rather different than something that ancient Neoplatonists would say, but there are some similarities and there are some congenialities, which is perfectly natural when you use this human capacity called intellect, because it is one intellect as a species or as a general being in all people, but in everyone is unique, because in the way we use the one in individual human beings, it is one as uniqueness, not one as uniformity. So if I have an intellect whose nature is the same as in everyone, my act of intellect, my act of life, my act of being, my energizing, me being energized being, makes this use rather unique of this same nature. So someone can be a fool, someone can be wise. I'm demonstrating one way of determining the one. And as I was telling this American professor simply read a lot of books, wrote a book himself, and failed at the level of you would call freshman, Platonic freshman, or theological, medieval or antiquity freshman, somebody that is sitting at the feet of the true master or true teacher, to make this assumption, which comes in fact from physics, because he's looking for something physical, as most of those guys are, whether it be political system or the system of the church, system of power, or whether that be a system of power over the world, which is why physics is practiced for the most time, apparently. So this is what unconsciously goads his intellect into completely wrong direction and completely wrong conclusions. Okay, this was Branko Malic, Kali Tribune, signing out. Thank you for your attention.